Next I'll have John Welsh, Global Rankings and Market Utopianism in the World System. Got bumped up. This is about global rankings, but specifically about academic rankings. But what I have to say about academic rankings pretty much applies to a lot of other ranking forms. This effectively is a sort of a summary of an article which is coming out in a journal called Globalizations. And the attempt is to try and find some sort of historical contingency out of the apparent historical necessity of academic rankings. So it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So I'm sure there's going to be holes and question marks everywhere, but never mind. If the oikos is the bundling of relations that are constitutive of humanity and nature, and if these bundles produce or reproduce a social nature, then we've got to identify the ecological technologies, the grids of intelligibility, the knowledge complexes and so on, which coordinate the political, the social, the cultural, material, symbolic, semiotic operations of the oikos. And I suggest that rankings are one of these technologies. But what are rankings? Well, first of all, rankings are systems of objects and means of objectification. I want you to think not just in terms of the ranked tables, because there are all sorts of forms of rankings, but the whole production of indices, of impact factors, of the whole system of assessment exercises, and the implications of all these things for the transformation of subjectivities, and crucially the serial asymmetries that these things inscribe in social relations. Rankings are also knowledge complexes, and I want you to think particularly in relation to those sort of periodic metrical revolutions that capital requires in order for value to be produced. Rankings are a territory. They are a territory upon which the environment-making state apparatus strategizes. So if the state is a territory, it's fundamentally geographic, but it's also technological. To quote Christian Parenti, the state must also seize and open nature more abstractly, by knowing it, making it legible, that is, by encasing it within the techno-managerial apparatus of administration, science and governance. Similarly, quote, to deliver nature to production, the state must continually measure, describe, categorize, represent, scientifically render legible and accessible the powers of biophysical reality. And there's no reason to suppose that what goes on in universities, for example, in the academic space, is not part of biophysical reality, because it is. So global rankings are therefore part of, I guess, what Jason Moore refers to as the Cartesian mapping and cataloguing of the globe as a potential storehouse of wealth that is capitalist knowledge forms. Well, why talk about this at all? Well, the crucial thing is that in liberal market utopianism, the rankings are supposed to be two things. They are, first of all, markets establishing. They establish markets. And secondly, they are ahistorical and determinist. And this is the impression that you get from literature, which constantly repeats how rankings are unstoppable and inevitable, and here to stay, and how we must all learn to live with them. And I reject both of these things. So to try and find the contingency of this apparent necessity, and to understand why rankings have emerged in a way which is not to establish markets, I think we need to look at the way in which rankings fit into the longue durée of historical capitalism. So if we think back to the 19th century and the emergence of the railways, Lenin reckoned the railways to be an index of the monopoly capitalist imperialism of that time, the Belle Epoque, the late 19th century, the Second Industrial Revolution, and so forth. And they had a particular transformative function. They brought together the they brought together the monopolist combines, industrial agriculture, banks, financial oligarchy, in a way that established territories for capital. Capital, of course, requires not just frangible barriers, but also spaces of flows. And perhaps it's a good way to think of this is to think about William Cronon's book, Nature's Metropolis, and how the railways were part of the production of the Midwest, particularly as a territory for capitalization. But of course the railways, were a knowledge form. They replaced temporal uniformity, for example, where there was temporal plurality. But the railways were not there forever. They were not here to stay. They were seemingly inexorable, but they were transient. They served a transformative function, and then they took their place in the landscape, so to speak. We would hardly say today that the railways transform our subjectivities. So, they were historically transformative. So we have to think today of the similar kind of tracings and apparatuses that transform our subjectivities, but in the idiom of capitalism in which we find ourselves, which of course since the 1980s has been neoliberal capitalism. And I would suggest, this is not exhaustive, but I want to think of 3 strategic shifts that have been, in a sense, particularly significant and imminent to neoliberal capitalism. The first one is core shift. There is a sense, I mean, Giovanni Arrighi talked about the sort of the impending, the possible Western superiority of force has reached its limits and shows strong tendencies towards implosion. There's a sort of sense that, with the rise of China and so forth, that there is a potential moment of shift underway in the core of the world system. And therefore, North Atlantic and primarily Anglophonic elites need to contrive the necessary apparatuses to retard or perhaps slow this down. Second shift is in the move over to accumulation by dispossession, particularly the emergence of strategies of appropriation in the idiom of neoliberalism. People like David Harbour talk a lot about the movement away from expanded reproduction and exploitation to accumulation by dispossession, and strategies of appropriation that are more visible in the core states, at least. I mean, they've always been there, but they're coming increasingly to characterize the way in which surplus value is extracted. And then thirdly, there is financialization, which really is just a great, if we think of, it's been effectively a revolution in the way in which the material is related to the symbolic. And it's, of course, interesting how those states which have most eagerly embraced financialization and absorbed it into their effective essence are also the states which have most readily accepted the logic of ranking, academic rankings, for example. So, how can we bring this all together and connect it to world ecology? Well, Jason and others have indicated that this is the notion of frontier inversion we talk about. Jason, for example, talks about how the world systemic shifts, that these 3 world systemic shifts, are connected to the historical phenomenon of frontier inversion in the world system. Now, what's the driving imperative for this frontier inversion? The dynamic structure of expanded reproduction through history is possible on a planet where capitalization is limited and most life reproduces without the help of capital. However, that's no longer the world system in which we find ourselves. This is what has bound capitalization historically to empire and colonialism in capital accumulation. But as the historical expansion of the totality of capitalist social relations increasingly manifests strategic crises in the world system, the outward movement of the frontier of capitalization to imperialism and colonialism, for example, Webb's Great Frontier, comes to an end in ecological contradictions on a global level. What was once the preparatory transformation for integration of people out there somewhere into the world system through the frontier of capitalization, in a historical narrative of expansion since the long 16th century, is now an inversion of that expansion to the core states, and the appropriations the appropriations of that expansion are now increasingly being experienced across numerous domains of life within those same core states as the frontier inverts globally in response to contradiction and crises in the expansion of the totality of capitalist social relations. So this is what I sort of imagine to be a sort of quite a fundamental world ecological imperative as to why these particular shifts are taking place and why certain apparatuses have to emerge as political response. I think what's particularly important is this notion of the zone of appropriation and the notion of the double movement that Jason talks about in the Web of Life. It's the expansion of the system of capitalist social relations since the long 16th century, the frontier of capitalization. If that is predicated, that's predicated upon a preceding frontier of appropriation that does not commodify, monetize, or marketize, but brings labour power within the reach of capitalist power, but not yet reproduced through the cash nexus. That's to say, labour power with a low-value composition. So, as I say, it's a double movement. It's a twofold frontier: a frontier of capitalisation proper, and a preceding frontier of appropriation. Capitalisation proper is the incorporation into the circuits of capital, whilst appropriation is the zone oriented to it, but nevertheless still outside the circuit of, but within reach of capitalist power. a kind of preparatory zone for terraforming subjectivities, culture, and social relations into something more congenial for capitalisation proper. So the commodity frontier is not simply the moment of expanding commodity production and exchange. It's an historical space in this expansion that's created when a zone of appropriation expands faster than a zone of commodification, with the former definitionally and historically preceding the latter. When the differential in this expansion slows down, and that space is squeezed, crisis conditions in surplus formation begin to emerge. A sufficient, unacknowledged surplus cannot be extracted through appropriation for the reproduction of accumulation cycles. And as subjectivities have been insufficiently transformed for integration into more highly articulate capitalist social relations, with real subsumption of labour. This is why systemic crises in accumulation require political efforts to extend, expand, or reconstitute the penetration of the frontier of appropriation, usually by the quantification of values, various other metrical impositions that are implicit in the imperialism of number, hence the fortuitous and timely emergence of rankings. So effectively, the idea is that rankings are a strategy of appropriation, rather than of commodification, incorporation proper into capitalisation. So we can find undercapitalised areas of activity today within the core states, which are ripe for surplus value appropriation, parallel, of course, to the extractive or agricultural industries in the global periphery. Collegial and cloistered academia in particular has hitherto been shielded from the zone of appropriation, but just as the railroad revolution of the 19th century extended the scale, speed and scope of appropriation, that's a quote from Jason Hall, establishing a metric for the purposes of control and internalisation to the reach of capitalist power, so now the emergence and spread of rankings, like a virus, which of course is a phrase used a lot in the literature about rankings, enlarges and deepens the area of relations appropriation necessary for continued surplus extraction through commodity production and value realisation elsewhere in the system, normally, of course, the core. So what this leads to is the idea that rankings, far from being the means of establishing markets, are an alternative to markets. They're an alternative to commodification proper. They are an alternative to monetisation. They are alternative to the kinds of exchanges, distributions and so forth, that are characteristic of markets. And the reason why is because they are not particularly intended to establish markets. They are intended to not exploit in production or to commodify. They are there to appropriate. And they are highly congenial to do this. I mean, if you think about rankings, they have a rather curious, almost feudal feel about them. I mean, the idea of ordinal hierarchies and so forth is something that seems to smack of feudalism. And of course, appropriation is something that is quite appropriate to that. So the point here also is to try and understand where we can identify contingency. So the relation between the frontiers of appropriation and capitalisation proper is dialectical. And it's in this dialectic, and it's in this dialectical space, that the market meets what Fernand Braudel called the anti-market in the ranking form. This is how we can understand the strange and hybrid form of rankings that fails repeatedly, despite great ideological and rhetorical effort, to live up to the definitional standards of markets for commodity exchange. This is because rankings have emerged in the transient space between the zones of appropriation and capitalisation proper. Giovanni Arrighi, drawing on Braudel, related the market and the anti-market as two dialectically related layers of the capitalist world system. The market is here a terrain of horizontal communication between numerous and various markets, exhibiting a degree of automatic coordination between supply, demand, prices. This is a space in which most researchers, of course, of academic rankings assume them to operate. It's the, what was it Lippides used to call the enchanted world, the exoteric enchanted world of the capitalist world system. The anti-market, however, occupies the same space, but where predatory practices rule through the law of the jungle, the real home of capitalism. This is where I suggest we look to understand the reason for rankings, the logic or axiomatic of their operation. And I argue that on the basis of this critical theory and historical perspective, that we should think upon the activities and labours of academic life as just such raw material life into which capitalisation proper never fully penetrates, and where the predatory practices of appropriation are as necessarily present as in all of the domains of capitalist society. The search is then on for pre-capitalist territories, that was a phrase of Maurizio Lazzarato, that are conducive to the constitution of those kinds of archaic subjectivities which are congenial to the axiomatic of the market anti-market dialectic, and that are suitable for effective hierarchical subjections which are necessary for appropriation. Obviously I've tried to pack a lot in there, but this kind of analysis gives us potentially three things. The first is dialectic and optimism. It allows us to understand the space of contingent struggle in rankings in a way that allows us to understand them as historically transformative and therefore capable of sublation, transcendence, counterconduct, and so forth, not these ahistorical and determinist apparatuses with which we are confronted and with which we all have to accommodate ourselves. The second potential in this is some kind of imminent critique, because obviously one of the things about appropriation is, like rent-seeking and reproductive labour, it's effectively unacknowledged by capitalist ideology. So the degree to which you can show that the imposition of rankings and other measures of neoliberalisation are in fact realising appropriation strategies rather than commodification proper, exploitation through rounds of production and so forth, then it opens up a space for an imminent critique. And crucially, it allows us to start the process of discursive struggle and to argue with more confidence why we should not accept being told repeatedly that rankings are here to stay, because they're not here to stay. They will be transcended or bypassed or some such. Okay. I think that'll do it. Thank you very much.